which one of the following is not a site for in situ method of conservation of flora, right? So the question is related to method of conservation, and they are asking us which of these is not a site for in situ conservation. So you must be aware of the fact that biodiversity conservation can be carried out based upon two methods or two approaches. First is in situ and second is ex situ. In situ conservation of flora means conserving that particular flora in its natural habitat. That means, let's say, if that flora is living in a forest, then, or if that flora is occurring in forest, then we will be conserving that flora in the forest itself, right? So, in situ conservation is in natural habitat. And how we can carry out in situ conservation of a particular species? We can do that by creating protected areas. And the protected areas, as you must be aware of, are of many types. And the popular are, first, national parks, second, wildlife sanctuary, third, community reserve, fourth, conservation reserve, and so on. Even Biosphere Reserve, Tiger Reserve, marine protected areas and elephant reserves are also the protected areas. And they are in situ method of conservation of flora as well as fauna. But on the other hand, ex situ conservation is that type or that method of conservation where flora or fauna is conserved outside its natural habitat. So, ex situ is outside natural habitat. That means, suppose a particular plant species is occurring in the littoral zone, then if that plant species need to be conserved, we can do that either in based upon in situ method or based upon ex situ method. In situ method, we will try to conserve that species of plant in the littoral zone itself. But in ex situ, we will take out that particular plant species from that habitat and we will try to conserve it in, let's say, botanical garden, right? So whenever we are trying to conserve that plant in the outside of its natural habitat, then it is considered as ex situ conservation. So this question is about which of the following is not in situ method of conservation. That means which of these are not the protected areas. So we know that biosphere reserves are the in situ method of conservation. Similarly, national parks are in situ conservation method and wildlife sanctuaries are also one of the important protected areas. And that's why all these three are in situ conservation methods. But on the other hand, botanical garden is ex situ method of conservation. And that's why answer is B. Apart from botanical gardens, seed banks, artificial breeding centers, zoo, etc. are considered as ex situ method of conservation. They are also important because if a particular species is threatened or it is at the verge of extinction, then that species can be revived if we try to protect it in the habitats outside its natural habitat, right? And that's why they are also one of the important methods of conservation. And answer for this question is B, botanical gardens. Three of the following criteria have contributed to recognition of Western Ghats, Sri Lanka, Indo-Burma region as hotspots of biodiversity. What they are? Sri Lanka, Western Ghats, its extension in Sri Lanka, and Indo-Burma. What are they? They are biodiversity hotspots. And this concept of biodiversity hotspots was firstly given by Norman Mayers. And thereafter, this particular concept or this particular term, biodiversity hotspot, is being taken over by Conservation International, which is a non-governmental organization in the United States of America. And that's why this particular biodiversity hotspot tag is important, because it not only recognizes the importance of a particular region, but at the same time, it also tries to highlight that that particular region, which is given a biodiversity hotspot tag, is now under threat. Right? So, what are the criterias for biodiversity hotspot? So, there are two prime criterias for biodiversity hotspot, and they are: first, at least 1500 vascular plant species. At least 1500 vascular plant species should be endemic to that region. Should be endemic to that region. And second, 70% of its natural vegetation should have lost. Right? So these are the two criteria based upon which the biodiversity hotspots are recognized. So out of these 6 criteria, 3 criteria satisfy this condition, and we are supposed to identify those criteria. So let us consider one by one. First is species richness. So we know that there are 2 prime concepts based upon which biodiversity is measured. First is species richness, and second is species evenness. Whenever we talk about species richness, we focus on how many species are occurring in a particular habitat. Suppose there are 10 species of plants and animals, then the species richness of that habitat becomes 10. But on the other hand, species evenness focuses on the relative number of these 10 species. That means how many species, how many individuals of species A, how many individuals of species B, and so on. That gives us species evenness. Right? So that is the difference between species richness and species evenness. This question gives us the term species richness. That means how many species. Right? So yes, this is a criteria because it talks about 1500 vascular plant species. So at least 1500 vascular plant species should be there if a particular region tries to get or want to get biodiversity hotspot tag. Right? So species richness is a criteria. Second is vegetation density. So vegetation density is not exactly the criteria based upon which biodiversity hotspots are recognized, and hence we should eliminate this particular statement. Third is endemism. So before we discuss about endemism being a criteria for biodiversity hotspot, what do we mean by endemism? Endemism means occurrence of a particular species at a particular location only. Right? So for example, Gir lions. So Asiatic lions occur in the Gir forest of Gujarat, and that's why we can say that Asiatic lions are endemic to Gir forest, because Asiatic lions do not are not found in other locations of India naturally, and that's why they are endemic to Gir forest, right? So yes, endemism is a criteria for biodiversity hotspot, because we know that at least 1500 vascular plant species should be endemic to that region if it is trying to get biodiversity hotspot tag, and that's why second statement is also a correct statement. Third is ethno-botanical importance. So this is not a criteria based upon which biodiversity hotspots are recognized, right? So ethno-botanical importance is not important for, or it is not the criteria for the biodiversity hotspot, and hence we should eliminate it. Next is threat perception. So we know that in order to get biodiversity hotspot tag, a particular location should have lost at least 70% of its original natural habitat. And that's why threat perception is the criteria, right? And last is adaptation of flora and fauna to warm and humid conditions. So adaptability is one of the important criteria of biodiversity, or it is one of the feature of biodiversity. And problem is that this particular adaptation is not a criteria as such for the recognition of biodiversity hotspot, and hence we should eliminate this as well, right? So based upon our discussion, we can say that it is first statement, third statement and fifth statement as the correct criteria for the recognition of biodiversity hotspots. So first, third and fifth. So we can say that option is C. Answer of this question is C, 1, 3 and 5. Question is, with reference to India, consider the following central acts. First is Import and Export Control Act 1947. Second, Mining and Mineral Development Regulation Act 1957. Third is Customs Act 1962. And fourth is Indian Forest Act 1927. You have to understand, or you have to answer, which of the above acts have relevance to or bearing on biodiversity conservation in the country. Fine. So out of these acts, which acts have bearing on biodiversity conservation in our country? So for sure, Indian Forest Act have its bearing on conservation of biodiversity, because Indian Forest Act tries to create various types of forests, and based upon that we'll be able to conserve biodiversity. Secondly, Customs Act 1962 also have its bearing on the conservation of biodiversity, because it regulate trade in the biodiversity and the components of biodiversity. Similarly, Mining and Mineral Development Regulation Act 1957 is also one of the important acts which ensures that biodiversity is conserved in our country, and that's why it also has its bearing on the biodiversity conservation. And lastly, Import and Export Control Act 1947. So this act also regulates import and export of biodiversity products, and hence this also act has its bearing on the biodiversity conservation, and that's why all these acts are related to biodiversity conservation, and hence answer is C, 1, 2, 3 and 4.